When I ponder why I ended up a science fiction writer, I've concocted an origin story that goes back to my childhood, which was in an Orange County, California, and it was orange groves. It was an agricultural community of orcharding, and it was a monoculture. It was a bit crazy, but it was very green. A giant coastal plain completely covered with orchards of orange trees, lemon trees, avocado trees, and tall eucalyptus windbreaks, because the Santa Ana wind would knock all these trees down. And I was a bookish kid. I loved Huckleberry Finn in particular. And I kind of had a mental model that had me living on the Mississippi River in 1840. And then during my teenage years, when I was in high school, those orchards were ripped out at a rate of about 10 acres a day every day for 10 years. That's fast, and what was replacing it was the kind of freeway and condominium apartment complex, a kind of social nightmare that is in Orange County today. And when I was a kid, I did not register that. I saw it, but I didn't understand it. And then I ran into science fiction. About the time I left for college, I ran into Clifford Simak and then Isaac Asimov, and new wave science fiction, which was happening in the 1960s. Where social issues were cast into the future and made to look bizarre and surreal in ways that were striking and made the present look different than it really looked. And so reading science fiction, I had this light bulb over the head experience where it felt more real to me than ordinary literature did, because it was capturing the feel of what I had gone through. And that perception has never changed for me. I still think science fiction is the best realism of our time. I believe that we are all in a science fiction novel that we are co-writing together. And I say that because of, acceleration of technology, the way every 5 years your life feels completely different, even though it feels just the same. And all of these things combine to make me stick with my original perception that science fiction was the best way to express our common American and global reality. When you think about the future, which everybody does, you have hopes and you have fears. So you have utopian literature and you have dystopian literature. Say you're beginning college, well, you hope that by going to college, you get a degree, you get some expertise, you have a good life. This is a utopian science fiction story that's personal to yourself. And a lot of times you'll come to realize that the world has to go well for your life to go well in that world. So your fate is tied to the world's. Then, insomnia in the middle of the night, you don't have the right blood chemicals in your brain. You begin to get fearful. If things don't go right, I'm doomed, blah, blah. Well, this is dystopian thinking. And so science fiction has a big basic split in it between hopeful visions and fearful visions of the future. And you can try to mix them together into a weave and try to do something that better models the way real life is, which is a mixture of hopes and fears. I mean, in terms of which kind of science fiction to write, I made a policy decision that it was important to write utopian fiction. At this point, it's been most of my career. It was 30 or 35 years ago. I had an idea that I would put 3 different futures in Orange County, California. This is an early idea. So I would have an after the fall, the United States had been blown up by neutron bombs. After the fall, a famous trope in science fiction. And then a dystopia where things had gone wrong, a very commercialized McDonald, Reagan-esque future. And then a utopia where things went right. Well, when it came time to write the utopia, I found it very hard, but intriguing. And so since that time, starting with the Mars trilogy, which is really the beginning of the 1990s, I've persistently come back to utopian fiction. I think that basically the actual future is radically unpredictable. And so what I do is to propose to myself a scenario for my plot and my story to unwind in, and then try to make it as plausible as possible without at all believing that this is actually going to happen. And it doesn't even matter, because it's the whole spread of science fiction stories taken together that creates all of the possibilities that you can explore by reading the genre. I try to make it plausible, but I'm not worried about whether it's actually the likeliest or the unlikeliest or not. If it makes an interesting story, then I'm willing to follow it. But I will say this, climate change is an overdetermining factor. It's going to happen. We're in it already. And so if you write near future science fiction, certainly it makes sense to pay attention to climate change as being not only likely, but inevitable in one form or another. So Ministry for the Future is about that. How can we dodge the mass extinction event and the human misery that climate change is going to hammer us with? How can we lessen that and get by in a best case scenario and still make that plausible? One inspiration for this novel was to push back against the idea that we could just adapt to the world getting hotter. There are eco-modernists, there are academics that are not really in public health, or their fields allow them to not imagine the physical impacts, civilizational impacts. And so they're saying, well, humans are adaptable, we'll just adapt. But a wet bulb 35 temperature, you can't adapt to, it kills you. And actually, being in Raleigh, North Carolina, I've visited many times, I have friends there. But a wet bulb 35 temperature is not at all unlikely in the American Southeast because it's a heat humidity index. And all of you know that it's not the heat, it's the humidity. Well, this is one of those old sayings that's not quite right. It's the two of them together. And if they're both high together, then sweating doesn't work. The human body will die, even if you're in the shade and got a fan on you and you don't have your clothes on, you will still overheat and die. Well, this is remarkable. And scientific community brought that to our attention within the last 5 years. And indeed, big heat waves have hit around the world and killed some people, but a wet bulb 35 temperature has only been hit, that has been registered on the gauges and the thermometers, et cetera, around the world, only a half dozen to 10 times, but the modeling shows that it's going to become common. When it hits an area where people are, the electrical system is going to have to work because you have to be in air conditioning. And if you're not, you're going to die from overheating, from hyperthermia. We evolved in ice ages. We're good in the cold. We're not good in the heat above the levels that we evolved in. We're not ready for it, and we'll die. And so that's why I started the Ministry for the Future with one of these events happening. It's all too plausible that it could, because we're not responding really fast. And so that was the origin of Ministry for the Future, was a sense of fear about this particular scenario coming true. I think that it's definitely would be helpful to have artists and science fiction writers in particular included in conversations where people are trying to think about what to do. Depending, of course, on their own expertise and what kind of books they write, they are generalists. And they're trying to look at not just secondary impacts, but also tertiary impacts. A great example, for instance, Ray Bradbury in Fahrenheit 451, that's often seen as a book about books, about burning books and Nazi book burning, etc., because of the main theme of it. But if you read Fahrenheit 451, what you see is a man inside a room that has screens on all four walls, and it's a reality TV show. It's the internet. Ray Bradbury, 1950, is imagining the effect of the internet on socialization. The guy can't relate to his wife. He gets out there with a crowd, and that crowd is reading books, or even going back to oral poetry, because they've memorized the books and they're talking to each other by a fire, going back to Paleolithic pleasures, because that guy's trapped inside the internet. And this is Ray Bradbury, 1950. So, okay, he was kind of a genius at intuiting the human impacts of technological systems. Not all of us are that talented. Scientists are generally more culturally aware than literary people are scientifically aware. So they are not to be critiqued on that basis of generalized knowledge. But what you can say for sure is that they have to dive deep into their silo to understand the working end of their discipline requires a depth of knowledge that means that they don't have a huge breadth of knowledge. But what you have when you get people in the humanities, like somebody who's maybe a philosophy major, is someone whose very job is to study the broad reach of all the cultural impacts put together, to study history itself. You need historians, you need philosophers, and I would argue that you need science fiction writers because of this habit of thinking scenarios and what they're for. I think this is good to talk about the blinders that everybody has, including me, for sure. It's an opportunity to talk about ideology. So, okay, in America, ideology is the bad beliefs that other people have. So you have truth, other people are ideological. Well, this is wrong and needs to be rethought. Everybody has an ideology, and it's a necessary component of consciousness, of cognition and perception. And there you have to say, well, what is an ideology? And what it is an imaginary relationship to the real situation. So let's unpack that. There is a real situation out there. I'm not saying everything's all relative and whatever anybody believes is true. I'm saying there's a real situation, but an individual has only an imaginary relationship to it. Your experience of that world is going to be partial. You'll have an information feed coming in through your iPhone and through your friends and through your classes and through everything else pouring into you that is 1/1,000,000th of the information about this world that you would need to know. So how do you order that? It's a huge onrush of information that is partial and yet overwhelming. And if you didn't have an ideology, you would be deeply confused. So what you do is you construct a model in your mind. You can call it a paradigm or a religion or a worldview. The names for it are various, but what it means is an overall picture of how the world works. And then you have a thing called confirmation bias, which is a cognitive error that you only can take in information that fits with your preceding information. Well, partly that's to keep from being deeply confused. You see things that support your imaginary portrait of the world, and then you push back against, or you don't even see. You can't take in information that messes with that model. So everybody has that ideology. Some people have an ideology that works such that everybody who is suffering in this world is somewhat invisible to them. And so they have blinders that work actually horizontally. And I will say that it is exactly in your undergraduate years where your awareness that the ideology that you've been given by your childhood and youth is inadequate to reality itself. And college is precisely the place to clear some blinders away, sharpen the lens, try to actually make your own ideology and examine your cognitive biases, your confirmation bias, everything else that comes in. Is that true or not? An ideology is precisely like a pair of glasses. So I take them off and I'm nearly blind. The world is a mess. It's like a bunch of blurry shapes. I'm scared. I put on my glasses of my ideology and okay, it's maybe leaving places that are still blank, but I can understand better from my own basis. It was true for me that the undergraduate years are the great breakpoint of reformation and the creation of a more useful ideology for yourself personally. And you have to be open to that in those years. Sometimes it will be confusing, sometimes it'll be even scary. Things that you thought that you believed, you'll suddenly realize you don't. New beliefs will come in that are actually quite frightening in their implications. That's what college is for. If you're given the assignment of trying to imagine a future and you decide that you would like to make it a positive future in which you have some agency, in other words, that what you do matters in the world, well, you've got quite a problem. You're going to be living in a century of climate change. And we are living in an economic system, a political economy, it can be called capitalism, that isn't well suited to dealing with climate change and mitigating climate change. So you're going to be living a fraught moment in human history, inevitably. So then you're asked to imagine a future. Imagine a good future. Well, it's like, well, wait a second. I would like to imagine a future in which everything was all right from the get-go. Well, that's not going to happen. And so one principle for writing your future scenario should be this: what can't happen won't happen. So physical constraints matter. You're not in a Harry Potter novel. Magic doesn't work, and magical thinking doesn't work. So you have to stick within the physical laws of the universe, and also stick with this moment in history as your starting point and go from there. One thing you can remember is that everybody does have agency, that even if you're 1/8 billionth of the human community, especially being in general, I would say, an American, and therefore one of the more prosperous citizens on earth, you do have 1/8 billionth of the power to change things. And it doesn't sound like much, but on the other hand, once you get into the sciences, you realize that parts per billion is a real thing. There are poisons that can kill you in the parts per billion. There are students studying things that are in the parts per trillion range, and yet it still matters. Okay, I'm only 1/8 billionth of the world population, but if I put my shoulder to the wheel in my area of interest, then it will matter. So it's important to remember that the front is broad, and it's a wave of history, and your whole generation is going to be doing it. And whatever you're interested in personally, whatever your major is, wherever you begin to study, that is going to be part of the solution. That area, arts, humanities, engineering, sciences, medicine, political science, the social sciences, all of them. Every single one of those human endeavors is going to play its part in getting through this century in a good way. So you don't have to imagine, well, I need to be Iron Man, or I need to be Elon Musk, or whatever. If you come to a place where you feel empowered by what you've learned in college, that's going to stick with you and orient you lifelong. So I recommend it as a process to really work hard in your college years to pull together a vision of the world that will sustain you over the long haul, that gives life meaning.